Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. I've replayed my roommate's story countless times in my head, each detail becoming more vivid and terrifying with every retelling. Brandon first encountered whatever it was during one of his restless drives through the outskirts of our Denver suburb back in the winter of 2021. He'd developed this habit of taking long drives in the dead of night when insomnia gripped him, finding solace in the empty roads that snaked through the industrial district. It was nearly 4 a.m. when he first saw it. The temperature had dropped to well below freezing, and a thin layer of frost coated everything in sight. Brandon was cruising down Meridian Road, a stretch of asphalt bordered by abandoned lots and skeletal trees that clawed at the star-filled sky. The area had once been farmland before developers bought it up and left it to rot when funding dried up. He'd just passed the old grain silo when movement caught his peripheral vision. Something emerged from the dead cornfield to his left. Not the casual gait of a wandering animal, but a deliberate, calculated movement that made his stomach lurch. The figure dropped to all fours and began moving with a speed that defied explanation. Brandon's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he watched this thing bound across the frozen earth. What he described to me later still makes my skin crawl. The figure was completely black, as if it absorbed light rather than reflected it. But its face, God, that face, was bone white, almost luminescent in the darkness. It wasn't wearing a mask. The pallor seemed natural, organic. The features were distinctly human, but wrong somehow, like a photograph that had been slightly distorted. The creature reached the roadway and paused directly in Brandon's headlight beams. For a moment that felt like an eternity. It crouched motionless in the middle of the asphalt. Then, with movements too fluid to be human, it turned its head a full 90 degrees to stare directly at him through the windshield. Brandon swears those eyes weren't reflecting the light like an animal's would. They seemed to generate their own cold illumination. The encounter lasted maybe 10 seconds before the figure launched itself toward the opposite side of the road, disappearing into a drainage ditch with impossible agility. Brandon sat there in his idling car for several minutes, hands shaking, trying to process what he'd witnessed. He eventually drove home, but he didn't sleep for the rest of that night. 3 weeks passed before Brandon worked up the courage to drive that route again. This time, he brought along his coworker Jerome, thinking that having a witness might either validate his experience or prove he'd been hallucinating from exhaustion. Jerome was skeptical, but agreed to ride along, probably expecting nothing more than a boring late-night drive. They were approaching the same stretch of Meridian Road around 3:30 a.m. when Jerome suddenly grabbed Brandon's arm. "Stop the car," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the engine. About 50 yards ahead, perched in the bare branches of a massive oak tree, was a dark silhouette. Brandon eased off the accelerator, and they both strained to make out details in the dim glow of the headlights. The shape was too large to be a bird, too angular to be a bundle of leaves. As they drew closer, it became clear that something was indeed sitting motionless in those branches, positioned about 20 feet off the ground. When they were roughly 30 feet away, the figure began to move. It didn't climb down like a person or animal would. Instead, it seemed to flow down the trunk with liquid grace, its limbs bending at angles that made Jerome gasp audibly. The moment its feet touched the ground, it sprang across the road in 3 impossibly long bounds. This time, Brandon got a better look at the face. The white skin seemed to glow with its own inner light, and the features, while human in arrangement, were somehow too perfect, too symmetrical. The eyes were large and dark, set in deep sockets that gave them a hollow appearance. Most disturbing was the complete absence of expression. No fear, no curiosity, no acknowledgement of their presence beyond that calculated stare. Jerome started hyperventilating, stammering incoherently about what they'd just witnessed. Brandon spun the car around, tires squealing against the asphalt, and they spent the next hour driving through every back road in the area, searching for any trace of the figure. They found nothing but empty fields and abandoned buildings, the silence broken only by Jerome's nervous breathing and the occasional crack of settling ice. After the second encounter, Brandon became obsessed. He started carrying a camera in his car, plotting different routes through the area, even researching the history of the land. What he discovered only deepened the mystery. The property had been the site of a state psychiatric facility that operated from 1952 until 1987, when it was shuttered, following a series of scandals involving patient abuse and unexplained deaths. A week after Jerome's terrifying introduction to whatever lurked in those fields, Brandon decided to take a different approach. Instead of driving the main road, he would circle around through the residential area that bordered the old hospital grounds. He convinced himself that this would either prove the encounters were location-specific or demonstrate that his mind was playing elaborate tricks on him. The suburban streets were lined with modest houses, most dark except for the occasional porch light, casting weak yellow pools on the sidewalks. Brandon had just turned onto Clearwater Avenue when his rearview mirror caught something that made his heart skip. In the distance, barely visible in the red glow of his taillights, a dark shape was bounding down the middle of the street behind him. The figure moved with that same unnatural gait he'd witnessed before. Not quite running, not quite leaping, but something in between that covered ground at an alarming rate. Brandon accelerated, watching in horror as the shape grew larger in his mirror. The creature was gaining on him despite his increasing speed. Panic took hold as Brandon realized this thing was actively pursuing him. He floored the accelerator, taking corners at dangerous speeds, but each glance in the mirror showed the figure maintaining its relentless pace. The chase continued for nearly 2 miles through winding suburban streets before Brandon finally lost sight of his pursuer near a small shopping plaza. He pulled into the parking lot and sat there for 20 minutes, engine running, doors locked, scanning every shadow for movement. When he finally worked up the courage to drive home, he took a circuitous route that added an extra hour to his journey, constantly checking his mirrors for any sign of pursuit. The phone call came at 4:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in March. I was pulled from deep sleep by Brandon's frantic voice, barely coherent as he shouted instructions for me to grab a flashlight and meet him outside immediately. The urgency in his tone cut through my grogginess like a blade, and I stumbled out of bed, threw on clothes, and rushed to our front yard. Brandon's car skidded to a stop at the curb, and he practically fell out of the driver's seat, his face pale and drawn with terror. "It's here," he gasped, pointing toward the end of our street. I saw it 3 blocks away, moving through the Riverside neighborhood. We have to find it before it disappears again. Against every instinct screaming at me to go back inside and lock the door, I followed Brandon as he led me through our quiet suburban streets. The area we lived in was typical middle-class Denver: tree-lined streets, small front yards, and houses built in the 1970s that all looked remarkably similar in the darkness. We walked for nearly 40 minutes, flashlight beams cutting through the shadows, investigating every unusual shape or movement. The night air was crisp and carried the faint scent of flowering trees, a pleasant spring evening that should have been peaceful. Instead, every rustle of leaves or distant sound made us freeze and listen intently. It was near Riverside Elementary School that we finally encountered what Brandon had been tracking. The playground equipment cast strange shadows in the amber glow of a single streetlight, creating a maze of dark shapes and geometric angles. As we approached the chain-link fence that surrounded the play area, something moved near the swing set. The figure was crouched on top of the metal support beam, balanced with impossible steadiness about 8 feet off the ground. From our vantage point, we could see that same stark contrast, the deep black of its body against the pale luminescence of its face. It appeared to be scanning the surrounding area methodically, its head turning in slow, measured movements. We stood frozen, barely breathing, as the creature completed its survey. Then, as if it had suddenly become aware of our presence, it turned to look directly at us. Even from a distance of perhaps 30 yards, the intensity of that stare was overwhelming. The face showed no emotion, no recognition of us as threats or curiosities, just a cold, calculating assessment. Without warning, it dropped from the swing set with fluid grace and bounded toward the far side of the playground. We lost sight of it behind a storage shed, and by the time we ran around the building, the area was empty except for the gentle sway of the swings in the night breeze. By late March, Brandon's encounters had escalated from random sightings to what felt like deliberate appearances. He began to suspect that whatever this thing was, it had become aware of his interest and was intentionally revealing itself. The thought terrified him, but it also sparked a desperate need to understand what he was dealing with. On a Saturday night, he made the decision to return to Meridian Road where it all began. But this time he would be prepared for a confrontation. He loaded his car with a powerful camping lantern, a digital camera with night vision capabilities, and a baseball bat, though he admitted to me later that he wasn't sure what good a weapon would do against something that moved like liquid shadow. The drive to the old hospital grounds took 20 minutes through increasingly desolate industrial areas. Brandon parked on the shoulder of the road, positioned so that his headlights illuminated the field where he'd first encountered the creature. The car engine ticked as it cooled, the only sound in the profound silence that seemed to press against his eardrums. He sat there for nearly an hour, fighting the urge to start the car and drive away. Every shadow seemed to shift and move. Every distant sound made him grip the steering wheel tighter. Just as he was beginning to think the night would pass without incident, something stirred in the tall grass about 50 yards away. The movement was subtle at first, just a gentle swaying that could have been wind. But the night air was completely still, and Brandon watched with growing dread as the grass began to part in a deliberate line heading toward the road. Whatever was moving through that field was large enough to displace the vegetation, but quiet enough that no sound reached him through the closed car windows. When the figure finally emerged from the grass line, Brandon's hands were shaking so badly he could barely operate the camera. The creature stood at the edge of the field for a long moment, and for the first time, Brandon got a clear, unobstructed view of it in his headlight beams. The body was humanoid, but wrong in proportions. Too tall, with limbs that seemed slightly too long for the torso. The skin, or whatever covered it, was indeed black and seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But it was the face that made Brandon's stomach turn. While unmistakably human in its features, the skin was so pale it appeared almost translucent, with dark veins visible beneath the surface like a grotesque road map. The eyes were the worst part, large, dark, and completely without pupils or irises, just solid black voids that seemed to draw in light and hope alike. When the creature began walking toward his car with measured, deliberate steps, Brandon finally snapped out of his paralysis and grabbed for the ignition. After Brandon's close encounter, we decided that whatever was happening needed to be documented and investigated properly. The next morning, I accompanied him to the local police station to file a report, though we both knew how the conversation would go. Officer Hendricks listened politely to Brandon's account, took notes with the kind of practiced patience that suggested he'd heard stranger stories, and promised to increase patrols in the area. What surprised us was Hendricks's admission that they'd received 3 other reports in the past month of unusual activity in the vicinity of the old hospital grounds. 2 joggers had reported being followed by someone who didn't move right, and a security guard at a nearby warehouse claimed to have seen someone climbing the exterior walls of his building like a spider. Hendricks gave us permission to speak with Dr. Sandra Martinez, a local psychiatrist who had researched the history of the abandoned facility as part of her doctoral thesis. Dr. Martinez agreed to meet with us at her office downtown, and what she told us added disturbing context to Brandon's experiences. The Riverside State Hospital, as it had been officially known, housed nearly 300 patients at its peak in the 1960s. Treatment methods were primitive and often brutal, including experimental procedures that would be considered torture by today's standards. Dr. Martinez had uncovered records of particularly disturbing experiments conducted in the basement levels, including sensory deprivation studies and attempts to induce controlled psychological breaks. The facility was closed abruptly in 1987, Dr. Martinez explained, spreading photocopied documents across her desk. There was a fire in the East Wing that killed 17 patients and 3 staff members, but before that, there were reports of patients disappearing from their rooms, only to be found days later in impossible locations: ventilation shafts, crawl spaces, even outside the building despite being on the 4th floor. She showed us patient photographs from the 1980s, and one in particular made Brandon's face go white. The image showed a tall, gaunt man with prematurely white hair and unusually pale skin. According to his file, patient 247 had been admitted for severe dissociative disorder and had displayed what staff described as inhuman agility and nocturnal hyperactivity. He vanished 3 days before the fire, Dr. Martinez continued. His room was found empty despite being locked from the outside, and there were scratches on the interior walls that suggested he'd been climbing them. His body was never found in the ruins. Brandon and I exchanged glances, both thinking the same impossible thought. The timeline matched, the location was exact, and the physical description was disturbingly familiar. Armed with this new information, Brandon became convinced that what he'd been encountering was human, or had once been human. The idea that someone had been surviving on those grounds for over 30 years seemed impossible, but it was more palatable than the alternatives his imagination had been conjuring. We decided to conduct one final investigation, but this time we would go prepared and in daylight. Brandon borrowed night vision equipment from a friend who worked in security, and we planned to explore the ruins of the hospital during the day, then stake out the area after dark. The abandoned facility was larger than I'd expected, a sprawling complex of connected buildings surrounded by overgrown grounds and rusted fencing. We spent the afternoon documenting everything we could find: collapsed structures, basement entrances that led into flooded tunnels, and evidence that someone had indeed been using parts of the complex as shelter. In the basement of what had been the main treatment building, we discovered a makeshift living space. Salvaged furniture was arranged around what appeared to be a sleeping area, and there were stores of canned food and water containers. Most disturbing were the photographs pinned to the walls, dozens of images showing various people in the surrounding neighborhoods, including several of Brandon at his car. The pictures had been taken from impossible vantage points, high in trees, on rooftops, through windows of buildings that should have been inaccessible. Whoever had been watching had been documenting not just Brandon's movements, but those of numerous other people in the area. The level of surveillance was systematic and obsessive. As evening approached, we positioned ourselves in Brandon's car about a quarter-mile from the main building, equipped with night vision binoculars and cameras. We didn't have to wait long. Just after sunset, a figure emerged from one of the basement entrances and began moving through the grounds with that same fluid, unnatural gait Brandon had described. Through the night vision equipment, we could see that it was indeed human, but drastically altered by years of living in isolation and possibly mental illness. The figure's movements were those of someone who had adapted to moving in darkness, using unconventional methods of locomotion that appeared inhuman from a distance. Our final confrontation came not by choice, but by accident. As we watched the figure moving through the grounds, Brandon made the mistake of starting his car to adjust our position. The sound of the engine carried clearly in the still night air, and immediately, the figure stopped moving and turned toward our location. What happened next was like watching a predator lock onto its prey. The figure began moving directly toward us, covering ground with those impossible bounds that had terrified Brandon in previous encounters. But now, with the benefit of night vision equipment and the knowledge of what we were likely dealing with, the movements were clearly human, just highly practiced and adapted to an unusual environment. Brandon started to drive away, but I convinced him to stop. "We need to end this," I told him. "We need to know for sure." The figure approached our car and stopped about 10 feet away, crouched in a position that would allow for quick escape. In the green glow of the night vision, I could see the face clearly for the first time. While gaunt and altered by exposure and malnutrition, the features were unmistakably human. The pale coloration that had seemed so unnatural was the result of decades without proper sun exposure, and the large dark eyes were likely adapted to living in constant darkness. For several minutes, we stared at each other across the small distance that separated us. The figure showed no aggression, no fear, just the wary curiosity of someone who had been living on the margins of society for so long that normal human interaction had become foreign. Brandon slowly rolled down his window. "We're not here to hurt you," he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. "We just want to understand." The figure tilted its head, a gesture that was startlingly human despite the alien appearance. For a moment, I thought it might try to communicate. Instead, it simply turned and bounded away into the darkness, disappearing among the ruins with practiced ease. We never saw the figure again after that night. Brandon stopped taking his late-night drives, and I convinced him to report our findings to the appropriate authorities. A social worker and mental health team were dispatched to the hospital grounds, but they found the basement shelter empty, with no trace of recent habitation. Sometimes I wonder if the person we encountered found a way to rejoin society, or if they simply moved on to another abandoned place where they could exist without detection. Brandon still gets nervous when he has to drive through that area, but the terror has been replaced by something closer to sadness. The realization that what had frightened him so badly was simply another human being, broken by circumstances and time, trying to survive in the only way they knew how. The real horror, we learned, wasn't in encountering something inhuman in the darkness. It was in recognizing the humanity that can be lost when society fails its most vulnerable members, leaving them to adapt and survive in ways that make them seem like monsters to those of us who still live in the light. The summer of 2008 marked a turning point in my life, one that continues to haunt my dreams 16 years later. I was 16, not 14, as I sometimes mistakenly recall when trying to distance myself from the memory. That summer, I stayed with my grandparents in rural Pennsylvania while my parents worked through what they called adult problems back home. It was there I met Isabel, a name I've changed to protect her privacy. We connected instantly, two outsiders in a small town where everyone else had known each other since birth. My grandfather, a stoic man with hands hardened by decades of manual labor, had lived in that area his entire life. His weathered face told stories before his mouth ever opened. One particularly humid evening, as fireflies danced outside and the distant rumble of thunder promised a storm that wouldn't deliver, Isabel and I asked him about local legends. "You looking for trouble?" he asked, eyes narrowing beneath bushy eyebrows. When we insisted we were just curious, he reluctantly spoke of an abandoned property about a kilometer south of their home. "Property belonged to a man named Garrett Shaw," he said, his voice dropping to nearly a whisper despite us being alone in the house. "Came here from Ohio sometime around 1908. Built himself a fine house and a separate cabin where he'd disappear for days. Locals said he conducted experiments." Grandfather leaned forward, the wooden chair creaking beneath him. "One winter, folks noticed no smoke coming from his chimney for weeks. When they finally checked, everything was intact. Food on the table, coat on the hook. But Shaw was gone. Never found a trace of him. He warned us to stay away, saying the property had a history of bad luck for trespassers. My grandmother, overhearing from the kitchen, added her disapproval with a stern look that would normally have ended any foolish plans. But we were teenagers, convinced of our invincibility and skeptical of rural superstitions. To us, it sounded like the perfect adventure. That night, after my grandparents had gone to bed, Isabel and I whispered our plans through the open window between my grandfather's shed, where I slept, and the guest room where she stayed. The full moon cast long shadows across the yard, creating twisted shapes that seemed to reach toward us. "We should bring protection," Isabel suggested, her face half illuminated by moonlight. Not because I believe in ghosts, but because abandoned buildings are dangerous. I agreed. In my grandfather's shed, I found 2 hunting knives with worn leather handles. From the kitchen, I quietly borrowed 2 flashlights and extra batteries. The wall clock in the hallway read 11:23 p.m. when we slipped out the back door, careful to let it close without making a sound. The night air felt dense, unusually cold for July. Stars peppered the cloudless sky, but they offered little comfort as we followed the dirt road leading away from the safety of my grandparents' home. Isabel walked close beside me, our shoulders occasionally brushing. Despite our brave talk, I could feel her tension. "Do you actually know where we're going?" she whispered, after we'd been walking for 15 minutes. "South," I replied with more confidence than I felt. Grandfather said it was about 1 kilometer south. We had no map, no GPS. Smartphones weren't yet ubiquitous, especially not in this reception dead zone. All we had was a vague direction and the arrogance of youth. As the dirt road gave way to an overgrown path, I clicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting weakly through the darkness ahead. The forest seemed to close in around us, the spaces between trees narrowing. Several times I thought I heard footsteps behind us, only to turn and find nothing but shadows. Isabel must have felt it too, the sensation of being watched, because she moved even closer, her fingers gripping my arm. "Maybe this wasn't such a good idea," she murmured, but neither of us suggested turning back. After what felt like hours but was likely only 40 minutes, we spotted it, a dark silhouette rising from the forest floor. The house stood 2 stories tall, its Victorian architecture a stark contrast to the simple rural buildings we were accustomed to seeing. Windows like empty eye sockets stared back at us, and the wraparound porch sagged in the middle as if exhausted from decades of abandonment. We stood at the edge of the clearing, suddenly hesitant. The house seemed to be waiting for us, patient after all these years. "We came all this way," I said, though it sounded like I was trying to convince myself. Isabel nodded, and we approached, stepping carefully over the threshold of the property. Immediately, the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. I told myself it was just the natural coolness of a clearing at night, but the suddenness of the change left me unsettled. The front door hung partially open, swollen wood preventing it from closing properly. It groaned in protest as I pushed it wider, revealing a foyer with peeling wallpaper and a thick layer of dust covering everything except, and this detail still disturbs me, a set of footprints that led from the door to the staircase and back. "Someone's been here recently," Isabel whispered, pointing her flashlight at the tracks. "Probably other teenagers," I replied, though the footprints looked too large, too deliberate to belong to thrill-seeking kids. We moved through the first floor, our flashlights revealing a home frozen in time. In the parlor, furniture remained arranged as if awaiting guests. A moth-eaten sofa, 2 armchairs facing each other across a low table. On the walls hung paintings of landscapes I didn't recognize, the colors darkened with age. One painting particularly caught my attention. A forest scene at twilight with a small, indistinct figure standing among the trees, facing away from the viewer. The kitchen still contained dishes in the cabinets, some broken, others remarkably intact. A cast-iron pot sat on the cold stove, empty but clean, as if waiting to be used again. Most disturbing was the dining room, where places were set for dinner, 3 settings, though Garrett Shaw reportedly lived alone. The table was bare except for those place settings, and a single book lying open in the center, its pages yellow with age. I approached cautiously and directed my flashlight at the text. The book contained diagrams and dense text in what appeared to be Latin. Isabel, who had taken a year of Latin in school, tried to translate. Something about doors, passages. She shook her head. "My Latin isn't good enough." Throughout the house, in nearly every room, we found dolls. Not children's toys, but crude, handmade figures fashioned from twigs, cloth, and what looked disturbingly like human hair. They sat on windowsills, bookshelves, and furniture, their button eyes reflecting our flashlight beams. "Who makes dolls like this?" Isabel whispered, refusing to touch them. The second floor contained bedrooms, 3 of them, again at odds with the story of a man living alone. The master bedroom appeared undisturbed, bed neatly made, clothes still hanging in the wardrobe. The other 2 rooms were empty, except for bare mattresses and more of those unsettling dolls. In what must have been Shaw's study, we found bookshelves lined with texts on obscure subjects, ancient rituals, forgotten languages, and what appeared to be personal journals. I opened one, dated 1912, and read a passage. "The barrier thins near the cabin. I can hear them now, even from the house. They speak to me through the walls between worlds. Not much longer now." I closed the journal, suddenly eager to leave the house. The walls seemed to press inward, the air thick and stale, making it difficult to breathe. "Let's check the cabin," I suggested. Not because I wanted to, but because it felt like the next logical step in our ill-conceived adventure. The cabin stood approximately 50 yards from the main house, a simple wooden structure with a single window visible from our position. Unlike the house, which merely looked abandoned, the cabin projected an aura of wrongness that's difficult to articulate. The surrounding vegetation had grown wild everywhere except in a perfect circle around the cabin, as if nature itself refused to approach. As we made our way across the clearing, my flashlight began to flicker despite the fresh batteries. Isabel's did the same, the beams weakening with each step toward the cabin. "I don't like this," she said, stopping about halfway there. I was about to agree when I heard it, a voice, barely audible, coming from somewhere to our right. "Over here." The words weren't shouted, but somehow cut through the night air with perfect clarity. I stopped immediately, swinging my flashlight toward the source. "Did you hear that?" I asked Isabel, who looked at me with confusion. "Hear what?" I directed my failing flashlight toward a small mound of what appeared to be cement about 10 feet off our path. Something about it demanded my attention. Despite Isabel calling my name, I felt compelled to investigate. The mound was roughly oval-shaped, about 3 feet long and 2 feet wide, with a smooth surface unlike the crude cement work I'd expect in an abandoned property. As I drew closer, I noticed faint markings etched into its surface, symbols similar to those in the book we'd seen in the house. I reached out, fingers hovering inches above the strange object. A terrible coldness radiated from it, not physical cold, but something that seemed to reach past my skin and into my very thoughts. "Don't touch it," Isabel called, but her voice sounded distant, muffled, as if coming from underwater. My hand descended anyway, drawn by an irresistible urge. The moment my fingertips contacted the surface, the world around me vanished. Consciousness returned slowly, like struggling through layers of thick mud. I became aware of damp earth beneath me, the smell of rotting leaves, and complete darkness. My flashlight lay several feet away, its beam reduced to a faint glow that illuminated nothing. I sat up, head pounding with a migraine-like intensity. How long had I been unconscious? Minutes? Hours? The night sky offered no clues, clouds now obscuring the moon and stars. "Isabel?" I called, voice cracking. No response. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to my feet, retrieving my nearly useless flashlight. I swept the dim beam around, desperately searching for her. About 20 feet away, near the cabin's entrance, I spotted a shape on the ground. I ran, stumbling over unseen obstacles until I reached her. Isabel lay face down in the dirt, unmoving. When I gently turned her over, her skin felt ice cold despite the summer night. "Isabel, wake up!" I shook her shoulders, fear tightening my throat. Her eyes snapped open, unfocused and dilated. For a moment she stared through me rather than at me. Then a scream tore from her throat, raw, primal, filled with terror. "Leave us alone!" she shrieked, pushing away from me with surprising strength. I fell backward, confused and frightened. "It's me. What's wrong?" Her breathing came in rapid gasps as she pressed herself against the cabin wall. "He's been following us since we entered the forest, standing just at the edge of the light, watching." "Who? There's nobody." "You didn't see him?" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Tall. So tall. No face." I looked around us, seeing nothing but shadows. "There's no one here, Isabel. You must have had a nightmare." But even as I said it, I felt that same sensation from earlier, of being observed by unseen eyes. The darkness between the trees seemed denser, more purposeful. Isabel's condition alarmed me. Her face had a gray pallor, and a thin trickle of blood ran from her nose. When she tried to stand, her legs buckled beneath her. "We need to leave. Now." I helped her up, supporting most of her weight as we turned away from the cabin. As we began our retreat, I made the mistake of looking back. Just for an instant, in the weak beam of my flashlight, I thought I saw a figure standing in the cabin doorway, impossibly tall and thin, motionless. I blinked, and it was gone. "God help us," I whispered, no longer concerned with appearing brave. The journey back through the forest became a nightmare of disorientation and fear. Without clear landmarks and with our flashlights failing, we repeatedly found ourselves walking in circles. Trees that should have been familiar looked alien. Paths that should have led us home looped back toward the property we were trying to escape. Isabel's condition deteriorated with each passing minute. Her skin remained cold to the touch, her breathing shallow. She kept looking over her shoulder, flinching at sounds I couldn't hear. Once, she stopped suddenly, staring into the darkness behind us. "He's still following," she murmured. "He wants us to go back." I tightened my grip on her arm and pressed forward, choosing directions based on instinct rather than knowledge. Every shadow concealed potential threats. Every snapping twig signaled pursuit. The forest, which had seemed merely unwelcoming before, now felt actively hostile. After what seemed like hours of panicked wandering, we stumbled upon the dirt road. Relief flooded through me at this sign of civilization, however modest. Isabel had become too weak to walk on her own, so I hoisted her onto my back, her arms draped limply over my shoulders. The road led us back toward my grandparents' house, each step a small victory against the darkness behind us. Isabel's weight grew heavier as my strength waned. But the thought of stopping, of being caught by whatever she believed pursued us, kept me moving. When we finally reached the edge of my grandparents' property, I checked my watch, expecting to see that hours had passed. The digital display read 11:39 p.m. We had left at 11:38 p.m. 1 minute had elapsed during what felt like hours of exploration and terror. I stood frozen, trying to process this impossibility. Had my watch malfunctioned? Had we somehow experienced a shared delusion? Neither explanation satisfied the primal part of my brain that recognized we had encountered something beyond normal understanding. I called my uncle from my grandfather's landline, fabricating a story about Isabel falling and hitting her head while we were taking a night walk. He arrived within minutes, his expression shifting from annoyance to concern when he saw her condition. In the harsh interior light of his pickup truck, Isabel looked worse than she had in the forest. Her skin had a waxy quality, eyes sunken and unfocused. The trickle of blood from her nose had dried, leaving a dark streak against her pale skin. "What really happened?" my uncle demanded as we sped toward the county hospital 20 miles away. I hesitated, then told him everything. Grandfather's story, our midnight expedition, the house with its strange contents, the cement mound, our blackouts, and the impossible time discrepancy. His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "You stupid, stupid kids," he said, voice trembling with anger and what I now recognize as fear. That place has a history. People go missing. Others come back. Changed. At the hospital, doctors diagnosed Isabel with a severe concussion, though they seemed puzzled by some of her symptoms. While they examined her, my uncle pulled me aside in the sterile hallway. "Listen carefully," he said, keeping his voice low. In 1962, 4 high school students went to that property on a dare. Only 3 returned. In 1978, a research team from the state university spent a night there. They all came back but reported equipment failures and missing time. One researcher developed seizures that continued until his death 3 years later. In 1993, a family moved into that house despite warnings. They fled after 3 days, the mother babbling about voices in the walls and something in the cabin. They never returned for their belongings. He gripped my shoulders. "Whatever's in that place, it's not natural. You and your friend are lucky to be alive." Isabel remained in the hospital for 3 days. The physical wound on her head, a deep gash that neither of us remembered her receiving, required 12 stitches. But the psychological effects lingered much longer. She experienced nightmares, insomnia, and a persistent feeling of being watched. Sometimes, in mid-conversation, she would stop and stare at something over my shoulder, though nothing was there when I turned to look. The most disturbing development appeared 2 weeks after our experience. A scar formed around the healed wound on her head. Not the typical straight line of a surgical scar, but an intricate pattern resembling the symbols we had seen in Shaw's book and on the cement mound. When doctors examined it, they had no explanation. One elderly nurse crossed herself and refused to touch it. That was 16 years ago. I've since moved away from Pennsylvania, built a life, and tried to forget what happened that night. For years, I convinced myself we had encountered nothing more than an abandoned property and the power of suggestion, combined with teenage imagination. But certain facts remain unexplainable. The missing time, the mysterious wound on Isabel's head, the symbolic scar that followed. And most troubling, the recurrent dreams that have plagued me since that night. Dreams of standing in front of the cabin, hearing a voice invite me inside, and knowing that something waits there, patient and ancient. 3 years after our experience, driven by questions that wouldn't subside, I researched Garrett Shaw. County records confirmed he existed and disappeared in 1916, not the 1908 my grandfather had mentioned. More interesting were newspaper clippings describing Shaw as a scientist of unorthodox methods who had studied with renowned physicists before retreating to rural Pennsylvania. One article mentioned his obsession with thinning the veil between realities, language eerily similar to what I'd read in his journal. Most disturbing was a photograph accompanying the article. Shaw standing in front of his house, tall and gaunt, his eyes deeply shadowed. Behind him, barely visible in the cabin window, was a blurred figure that the caption did not mention. I've never returned to that property, though sometimes I dream of it with such vivid detail that I wake believing I've been there again. In these dreams, I always approach the cabin, always hear the voice calling me, always feel the pull towards something waiting inside. Isabel and I lost touch after that summer. Last I heard, she had moved to Arizona, as far from Pennsylvania forests as possible. I wonder if she still feels watched, if she still sees movement at the corner of her vision, if the scar still forms perfect, impossible symbols on her skin. Sometimes, on particularly dark nights, I find myself staring into the shadows of my bedroom, remembering the sensation of unseen eyes. I wonder what would have happened if we had entered the cabin. I wonder what Garrett Shaw found behind the thinning veil. Most of all, I wonder if part of us never left that forest, if something of our essence remains there, trapped in that single minute that contained hours of experience. The rational part of my mind dismisses these thoughts as the lingering trauma of a frightening teenage experience. But another part, the part that feels the weight of unseen observation in empty rooms, knows that some questions are better left unanswered, some doors better left unopened. Whatever waits in that cabin is still waiting, and always will be. After 20 years behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler, you develop instincts that can't be taught. The highway becomes a second home, and danger, well, you learn to smell it coming like diesel on the wind. As a veteran long-haul driver for Continental Freight, I've hauled everything from baby formula to industrial equipment across all 48 contiguous states. My colleagues call me Rocco Delgado, the Road Warrior, a nickname I earned after driving 36 hours straight during the blizzard of '03 to deliver medical supplies to a hospital in Minnesota. But this story isn't about heroics. It's about something that happened to me on August 14th, 2010. Something that still visits me in my nightmares. The day began routinely enough. I'd picked up a load of high-end furniture in Newark, bound for a boutique store in a speck-on-the-map Pennsylvania town called Whiteland. My dispatcher had warned me the route would take me through what she called the sticks, rural backroads where GPS was more suggestion than science. I didn't mind. After 2 decades of interstate highways and truck stops that blended together in a fluorescent haze, I welcomed the change of scenery. The morning sun filtered through the trees as I navigated the winding roads of rural Pennsylvania. This was Amish country, where horse-drawn buggies shared the road with motorists, and billboards gave way to hand-painted signs advertising fresh eggs and homemade quilts. My rig, a midnight blue Peterbilt I'd named Bertha, handled the curves with the grace of a veteran dancer. "Just you and me, old girl," I said, patting the dashboard as Bertha's engine rumbled in response. The late summer heat pressed against the windows like a living thing. I had the AC cranked but rolled down the windows anyway, letting the humid air carry in the scent of fresh-cut hay and wildflowers. The radio faded in and out as I drove deeper into the countryside, local stations giving way to static until I finally turned it off, content with the rhythmic hum of tires on asphalt. Around noon, my stomach growled a reminder that I'd skipped breakfast. Up ahead, a weather-beaten sign proclaimed, "Earl's Rest Stop and Gas, last service for 47 miles. Perfect timing. I signaled and eased Bertha into the gravel lot, the brakes hissing as we came to a stop. Earl's was one of those places time forgot, a single-pump gas station with a small convenience store attached. The wooden structure had probably been white once, but years of weather and neglect had aged it to the color of old bones. A couple of picnic tables sat beneath an ancient oak tree, its sprawling branches offering the only real shade in sight. I climbed down from the cab, my joints popping in protest after hours of sitting. The heat hit me like a physical force, instantly plastering my shirt to my back. I stretched, rolling my shoulders to work out the kinks, and headed inside. A bell above the door announced my entrance. The interior was dim and cool, the ancient air conditioner rattling but functional. Shelves of dusty merchandise lined the walls, everything from canned goods to fishing tackle. A glass refrigerator case hummed in the corner, filled with beverages and prepackaged sandwiches. Behind the counter stood a man who could only be Earl himself. He had the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades under the sun, his skin leathery and creased like an old baseball glove. A gray beard reached halfway down his chest, and sharp eyes watched me from beneath bushy eyebrows. "Afternoon," he greeted, his voice gravelly from what I guessed was a lifetime of cigarettes. "Afternoon," I replied, nodding as I made my way to the refrigerator case. I grabbed a turkey sandwich and a bottle of Coke, then added a bag of chips for good measure. As I approached the counter, Earl's eyes narrowed slightly, studying me. "You passing through?" he asked, ringing up my purchases. "Yep, heading to Whiteland. Got a delivery." Earl paused, his finger hovering over the register keys. "Whiteland, huh? Not much out there." "That's what they tell me. Small furniture store, family owned." "Stevens' place?" When I nodded, Earl continued. "Mary Stevens is good people. Her husband passed about 5 years back. Cancer. She's been running the place alone since. I nodded, appreciating the small-town knowledge that you'd never get at a Flying J or Love's travel stop. Earl bagged my food, then hesitated before handing it over. Listen, you be careful on them roads, you hear? Especially after dark. Something in his tone made me pay attention. Any particular reason? He scratched his beard, eyes darting to the window before returning to me. Just not a good idea to be stranded out there. Cell phones don't work worth a damn, and some of the locals, well, they don't take kindly to outsiders. I'd heard variations of this warning in small towns across America, usually amounting to nothing more than ordinary xenophobia. Still, Earl seemed genuinely concerned. I appreciate the heads up, I said, taking my bag. I'll keep my eyes open. Outside, I settled at one of the picnic tables, unwrapping my sandwich as I surveyed the empty lot. The only sound was the rustling of leaves and the occasional buzz of cicadas hidden in the surrounding woods. It was peaceful in that lonely way that makes you acutely aware of your solitude. Halfway through my meal, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A vehicle pulled into the lot. A Chevy, old but well-maintained. Its once blue paint now a patchwork of rust and body filler. It parked near the tree line, the driver remaining inside. I couldn't make out his features clearly through the dusty windshield. But something about the stillness of the silhouette raised the hairs on the back of my neck. He wasn't doing anything threatening, just sitting there. But instinct told me to finish my lunch quickly. As I gathered my trash, I felt eyes on me. The man in the Chevy hadn't moved, but I could sense his attention like a physical weight. I tossed my garbage in the bin and strode back to Bertha, keeping my movements casual while scanning my surroundings. Inside the cab, I locked the doors, a habit born of years on the road. As I started the engine, I glanced at the Chevy in my side mirror. The driver was now visible, a broad-shouldered man with a thick beard and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He was watching me with an intensity that seemed out of proportion for a chance encounter at a rest stop. I put Bertha in gear and pulled out, checking my mirrors. The Chevy remained stationary, but as I turned back onto the main road, I saw it pull out behind me. Probably nothing, I muttered to myself. Guys heading the same direction. But as the miles stretched on and the Chevy maintained a consistent distance behind me, that crawling sensation between my shoulder blades refused to subside. The road ahead wound through increasingly remote territory, with dense forest pressing in on both sides like closing walls. Earl's warning echoed in my mind. You be careful on them roads, you hear? I adjusted my mirrors, keeping one eye on the persistent blue Chevy as Bertha carried me deeper into the Pennsylvania backwoods, where cell reception was non-existent and help, if needed, would be a very long time coming. The two-lane road stretched before me like a gray ribbon laid across the rolling Pennsylvania countryside. Under normal circumstances, I would have enjoyed the drive. The way the afternoon sun dappled through the canopy of trees, the occasional glimpse of wildlife at the forest edge. But the Chevy's constant presence in my rearview mirror had transformed the scenic route into something ominous. For 20 minutes, I maintained a steady pace, neither speeding nor slowing, watching as the vehicle behind me adjusted to match. When I increased my speed slightly, the Chevy followed suit. When I decelerated to test my suspicions, the blue sedan slowed as well, maintaining the same precise distance. "What's your game, friend?" I muttered, adjusting my mirrors again. The road curved sharply, revealing a steep incline ahead. Bertha groaned as I downshifted, the heavy load of furniture making itself known as we began to climb. The Chevy dropped back slightly on the hill, but as soon as we crested the top, it closed the gap again. I reached for my cell phone, more out of habit than hope. As expected, the screen displayed no service. We were deep in what truckers call a dead zone. I was on my own. Ahead, a small gravel turnout appeared on the right, one of those spots the Department of Transportation creates for truckers to pull over and check their loads. I signaled and eased Bertha into the clearing, hoping the Chevy would continue past and confirm my paranoia as nothing more than road fatigue. The blue sedan slowed as it approached the turnout, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought it would follow me in. Instead, it accelerated at the last second, disappearing around the next bend. I exhaled slowly, tension draining from my shoulders. Getting jumpy in your old age, Rocco, I chided myself, but still didn't leave the safety of the cab. Following protocol, I climbed out and did a walk around of the truck, checking straps and ensuring the load was secure. The forest surrounded the turnout on 3 sides, the trees standing like silent sentinels. No other vehicles had passed since I'd pulled over, and the silence was profound, the kind of quiet that makes your ears strain for any sound. I was tightening a strap when I heard it, the distant rumble of an engine approaching. My hand froze on the ratchet. Seconds later, the blue Chevy reappeared, moving slowly this time, deliberately. It turned into the gravel clearing and positioned itself to block my exit to the road. My heart hammered against my ribs as I moved quickly back toward the driver's side door. Before I could reach it, the Chevy's door swung open. The man who emerged was imposing, 6 foot something of solid mass with a thick beard that covered most of his face. His eyes were hidden behind reflective sunglasses, but I could feel them fixed on me. He wore faded jeans, work boots, and a flannel shirt with the sleeves cut off, revealing muscular arms covered in crude tattoos. I reached the cab and hauled myself inside, locking the door as the stranger approached. He moved with purpose, his gait steady and unhurried, like a predator confident in the inevitability of the hunt. "Can I help you?" I called through the partially opened window, fighting to keep my voice level. He didn't respond, just kept coming. I reached for my phone again, knowing it was useless but needing to do something. The screen remained stubbornly dark, no bars of service to be found. The man reached the door and tested the handle, finding it locked. A smile, or something like it, twisted beneath his beard. Without warning, he pounded his fist against the window, the impact reverberating through the cab. "What do you want?" I demanded, anger temporarily overriding fear. Still silent, he pounded again, harder this time. I remembered the tire iron I kept secured under the seat, a precaution from years on the road. Without taking my eyes off the stranger, I reached down and felt the cold metal against my palm. I pulled it free and held it up where he could see it. "Back off, buddy," I warned. "I don't want trouble, but I'm not looking to be anybody's victim today." The man's expression changed then, not fear, but something like amusement. He held up his hands in mock surrender, then turned and walked back to his vehicle. For a moment, relief washed over me. Then he returned, this time carrying a crowbar nearly twice the size of my tire iron. "Jesus Christ," I breathed, jamming the key into the ignition. Bertha's engine roared to life as the man approached with his weapon. I threw the truck into reverse, tires spewing gravel as I backed up, then executed a tight turn that barely missed the tree line. The Chevy was still partially blocking my exit, but there was just enough room to squeeze by if I didn't mind a few scratches. I gunned the engine, sideswiping the Chevy as I accelerated onto the road. The scrape of metal on metal was jarring, but I kept my foot on the accelerator, watching in the mirror as the bearded man ran back to his vehicle. "Come on, Bertha," I urged, pushing the truck harder than I should have on the winding road. "Don't fail me now." The speedometer crept up, 50, 55, 60. Taking curves at this speed in an 18-wheeler was dangerous, but the alternative seemed worse. In the mirror, I saw the Chevy pull onto the road, its front fender crumpled where I'd hit it. The chase was on. I had the advantage of knowing my vehicle's capabilities, but the Chevy had speed and maneuverability. On straightaways, it gained ground rapidly. When the road curved, I used Bertha's bulk to prevent passing, swinging wide to block both lanes. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, sweat trickling down my spine as I navigated the rural highway at breakneck speed. Mile markers flashed by, each one taking me further from civilization and help. The road descended into a valley, where a small bridge crossed a stream. As I approached, I saw a road sign indicating a state park entrance ahead. A plan began to form. Not a good one, but better than continuing this deadly game of cat and mouse on open roads. The sign for Blackwater State Park appeared suddenly on the right. I cut the wheel sharply, barely making the turn, the trailer swinging wide behind me. The park road was narrower than the highway, barely wide enough for my rig. Trees closed in on both sides, their branches scraping against the trailer like skeletal fingers. In the mirror, I saw the Chevy make the turn, fishtailing slightly before straightening out. But now the advantage was mine. The road was too narrow for him to pass, and my truck was leaving him little room to maneuver. "Let's see how you like the scenic route," I muttered, pushing deeper into the park. The road wound through the forest, occasionally opening into small clearings before plunging back into dense woods. Signs for camping areas and hiking trails flashed by, but I saw no other vehicles or people. In August, the park should have been busy with summer visitors, but this section seemed deserted. After about a mile, I spotted a ranger station up ahead, a small wooden building with a flagpole and an empty parking area. I pulled in, screeching to a halt in front of the building, and jumped down from the cab, tire iron still clutched in my hand. I bounded up the steps and tried the door, locked. Through the windows, I could see a tidy but unoccupied office. A sign on the door read, "Ranger on patrol. For emergencies, call 911. The Chevy's engine grew louder as it approached. With no time to try breaking in, I sprinted around the back of the building, looking for a place to hide or a weapon better than my tire iron. Behind the station, a trail led into the woods. Without hesitation, I plunged into the forest, the underbrush tearing at my jeans as I ran. The tire iron felt inadequate against the crowbar, but it was all I had. I hadn't gone far when I heard the Chevy pull into the station clearing. The engine cut off, followed by the slam of a car door. I pushed deeper into the woods, trying to move quietly while putting distance between myself and the ranger station. The forest was dense, sunlight filtering through the canopy in narrow beams that did little to illuminate the forest floor. I stumbled over roots and rocks, each sound I made seeming impossibly loud in the stillness. Behind me, I heard the heavy footfalls of my pursuer, not running, but moving with the confident pace of someone who knows their prey has nowhere to go. I ducked behind a massive oak tree, pressing my back against the rough bark, struggling to control my breathing. The footsteps grew closer, then paused. I held my breath, tightening my grip on the tire iron. A twig snapped nearby, 10 feet away, maybe less. "I know you're out here, trucker." The voice was deep and raspy, the first words I'd heard him speak. "Might as well come out. These woods go on for miles, and night comes early under the trees." I remained frozen, not daring to move a muscle. "You dinged my car back there," he continued, his tone conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. "That's gonna require compensation." Another snap of a twig, closer now. "I'm not an unreasonable man. Come on out, we'll discuss terms." I heard him moving again, circling around my position. I rotated slowly, keeping the tree between us, praying he wouldn't spot me. "Have it your way," he called out. "But remember, you chose this." The footsteps receded, growing fainter until I could no longer hear them. Still, I waited, counting to 300 in my head before daring to peek around the tree. The forest appeared empty, no sign of the bearded man. Had he given up? Returned to his car? Or was he waiting silently, hoping I'd reveal myself? I had to get back to Bertha. Standing here in the woods, I was vulnerable. In the truck, I at least had walls of steel between me and danger. Moving as quietly as possible, I began to retrace my steps toward the ranger station, pausing frequently to listen. The forest seemed to hold its breath around me, the only sounds the occasional call of a bird and the pounding of my own heart. As the ranger station came into view between the trees, I dropped to a crouch, scanning the clearing. The Chevy was still there, but there was no sign of its driver. My truck sat where I'd left it, the driver's door still open. I waited, watching for any movement, any hint of an ambush. Minutes stretched by with no sign of the bearded man. I had to make a decision. Stay hidden and hope for help to arrive, or make a dash for the truck. The choice was made for me when I heard a vehicle approaching on the park road, the rumble of an engine growing louder. I couldn't see it from my position, but it sounded larger than the Chevy. A park ranger, perhaps? Or other visitors? It was now or never. I sprinted from the tree line, crossing the open ground to Bertha in seconds that felt like hours. I threw myself into the cab, slammed the door, and jabbed the key into the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I looked up to see the bearded man step out from behind the ranger station, crowbar in hand. Our eyes locked for a moment, his still hidden behind those reflective sunglasses, mine wide with fear and determination. Then I slammed Bertha into gear and peeled out of the clearing, back onto the park road. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing there, watching me go. He made no move to follow, no rush back to his vehicle. He simply stood, crowbar dangling at his side, as if confident our paths would cross again. As I navigated back toward the highway, an SUV with Blackwater State Park emblazoned on its side passed me going the opposite direction, the vehicle I'd heard approaching. I considered flagging it down but decided against it. The bearded man might be spinning his own story to the ranger even now, and I needed to make my delivery and get as far from these woods as possible. Back on the main road, I pushed Bertha to her limits, eager to reach Whiteland and civilization. But as the miles passed and the adrenaline began to subside, questions plagued me. Who was the bearded man? What did he want? And was this truly over, or merely a pause in whatever sick game he was playing? The road ahead beckoned, each curve revealing more of the unknown. And somewhere behind me, I felt certain, a blue Chevy was back on the hunt. The sign for Whiteland appeared just as the afternoon began its slow fade toward evening. Welcome to Whiteland, PA, Esther 1832, population 967. Below that, someone had added a hand-painted addition, home of the annual Apple Harvest Festival. The cheerful greeting stood in stark contrast to the knot of tension that had settled between my shoulder blades. I eased Bertha onto the town's main street, which was exactly what you'd expect in a community this size, a single thoroughfare lined with brick buildings, most dating back to the early 1900s. A hardware store, a diner, a small grocery, and a handful of specialty shops made up the business district. American flags hung from lampposts, and flower baskets added splashes of color to the sidewalks. On any other day, I might have found it charming. Today, every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every parked car a potential ambush. Stevens Furniture and Fine Home Goods was located at the far end of Main Street, a two-story brick building with large display windows showcasing dining sets and bedroom furniture. I pulled Bertha around to the loading dock at the rear, backing her in with the practiced ease of 2 decades behind the wheel. As I shut down the engine, the silence was almost deafening after hours of road noise and racing thoughts. I sat for a moment, scanning the area for any sign of a blue Chevy, before climbing down from the cab. A bell jangled as I entered through the rear door, stepping into a stockroom lined with inventory. The space was immaculate, furniture pieces draped with protective coverings and arranged with military precision. "Hello," I called out. "Delivery from Continental Freight." A moment later, a woman appeared from the showroom floor, petite, with silver hair styled in a neat bob, and alert blue eyes that missed nothing. She wore a simple blouse and slacks, with a tape measure draped around her neck like a scarf. "Mr. Delgado?" she asked, extending her hand. "I'm Mary Stevens. We've been expecting you." Her handshake was firm, her gaze direct. I immediately liked her. "Call me Rocco, ma'am. I've got your shipment from Kensington's. Where would you like it?" She gestured to a cleared area in the stockroom. "Right here is fine. I've got my nephew coming in tomorrow to help move it to the floor." She studied my face, her expression shifting to concern. "Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." I hesitated, unsure how much to share. "Had a bit of trouble on the way here. Nothing I couldn't handle." Mrs. Stevens's eyes narrowed slightly. What kind of trouble, if you don't mind my asking? Something about her manner, straightforward, no nonsense, made me decide to tell her. As we began unloading the furniture, I recounted my encounter with the bearded man, from the rest stop to the chase through the state park. She listened without interrupting, her face growing increasingly grave. When I finished, she nodded as if I'd confirmed something she already suspected. "You'd better come inside," she said. "Let me fix you some coffee." The store's break room was small but comfortable, with a round table and chairs that had probably once been floor models. Mrs. Stevens busied herself with an ancient percolator while I sat, the events of the day catching up to me in a wave of exhaustion. "You're not the first," she said finally, setting a steaming mug in front of me, "to have an experience like that on those roads." I wrapped my hands around the mug, grateful for its warmth despite the summer heat. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Stevens took a seat across from me. "Over the past few years, there have been incidents. Travelers harassed, chased. Mostly out-of-towners, people passing through who wouldn't know to be cautious. Has anyone reported it to the police?" "Oh, yes. Sheriff Jenkins has files on at least a dozen complaints." She sighed. "But proving who's responsible is another matter entirely. The descriptions vary. Sometimes it's a blue Chevy, sometimes a black pickup. Sometimes the driver is bearded, sometimes clean-shaven. You think it's more than one person?" The idea of a group of locals targeting travelers made my skin crawl. "I think..." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I think there are elements in these woods that prefer to be left alone. People whose families have lived off the grid for generations, who view outsiders with suspicion at best, hostility at worst." "Like some kind of backwoods mafia?" She smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Something like that. They control certain territories, hunting grounds, fishing spots, patches of forest where they harvest timber illegally, and they don't take kindly to strangers wandering into their domain." I took a sip of coffee, processing this information. "The man at the rest stop, Earl. He tried to warn me, I think." "Earl knows better than most. His place sits right at the edge of what locals call contested territory. He's managed to maintain a kind of neutrality over the years." "So, what happens to the people who get chased?" I asked, not entirely sure I wanted the answer. Mrs. Stevens's gaze met mine, steady and unflinching. "Most get scared off, like you. Others..." She shrugged. "There've been disappearances. Nothing that could be definitively linked to these incidents, but enough to raise questions." A chill ran down my spine despite the warm room. "Shouldn't someone do something? The state police? The FBI? With what evidence? You said yourself there was no one around to witness what happened to you. And without bodies, without proof of criminal activity beyond harassment." She shook her head. "Besides, these families have roots here that go back to before the revolution. They know every cave, every hollow, every hidden trail. If they don't want to be found, they won't be." The conversation was interrupted by the jingle of the bell from the showroom. Mrs. Stevens excused herself to assist a customer, leaving me alone with my thoughts and half-empty coffee mug. I pulled out my phone. 3 bars of service now that I was in town. I should call my dispatcher, let her know about the delay, maybe even report the incident to the local authorities. But what would I say? That I was chased by a bearded man in a blue Chevy who never actually threatened me verbally? It sounded paranoid even to my own ears. Before I could decide, Mrs. Stevens returned, accompanied by a man in a tan sheriff's uniform. He was tall and lean, with the weathered complexion of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. Gray hair peeked out from beneath his hat, and deep lines framed eyes that had seen more than their share of trouble. "Rocco, this is Sheriff Tom Jenkins," Mrs. Stevens introduced us. Tom, this is the truck driver I was telling you about, the one who had the encounter on Route 16. Jenkins extended his hand, his grip firm and calloused. Mrs. Stevens gave me the broad strokes, but I'd like to hear it from you if you don't mind. For the second time that day, I recounted my experience, this time with more detail, knowing I was speaking to law enforcement. Jenkins listened attentively, occasionally making notes in a small pad. "Can you describe the vehicle more specifically?" he asked when I'd finished. "Year, model, any distinguishing features?" I thought back to the Chevy. Late 90s model, I'd guess. Sedan, four-door, originally blue but faded with patches of primer or body filler. Pennsylvania plates, but I couldn't make out the number. Front fender would be damaged now where I sideswiped it. Jenkins nodded, making another note. "And the driver? Height, weight, any identifying marks besides the beard?" "Tall, 6'2", maybe 6'3". Heavy set but solid, not fat. Beard was dark brown, nearly black. Wore sunglasses the whole time, so I never saw his eyes. Had tattoos on his arms, but I couldn't make out what they were. Flannel shirt with the sleeves cut off, jeans, work boots." "Did he say anything to you? Make any specific threats?" I shook my head. "Not until I was hiding in the woods. Then he said something about me dinging his car and requiring compensation. Said he wasn't unreasonable and wanted to discuss terms." Jenkins exchanged a glance with Mrs. Stevens that I couldn't interpret. "Well, Mr. Delgado, what you're describing matches a few other reports we've had. I'll add yours to the file. Keep an eye out for the vehicle." His tone was professional, but not particularly urgent, as if he were taking a report about vandalism rather than a potentially dangerous stalker. "That's it?" I couldn't keep the incredulity from my voice. "This guy chased me through a state park with a crowbar, and all you're going to do is add it to the file?" Jenkins didn't seem offended by my outburst. "I understand your frustration, sir. But the reality is, no crime was actually committed. He didn't assault you, didn't explicitly threaten you. Harassment, maybe, but even that would be hard to prove without witnesses. He had a crowbar, which isn't illegal to possess." Jenkins' tone remained patient. "Look, I'm not dismissing what happened to you. It's concerning, and it fits a pattern we've been tracking. But my jurisdiction is limited, my resources even more so." Mrs. Stevens placed a hand on my arm. "Tom does what he can, Rocco, but these woods..." She glanced toward the window, where twilight was beginning to settle over the town. "They have their own rules, their own justice." Jenkins cleared his throat. "That said, I'd advise you not to take the same route out of town that you came in on. There's a longer way around. Adds about 40 minutes to your drive, but it sticks to main roads, passes through more populated areas." He pulled out a map and traced an alternate route with his finger. "Take Route 29 south to the interstate, then loop back west. Avoid Route 16 and anything that cuts through the state forest." I studied the route, committing it to memory. "You think he's still out there? Waiting?" Jenkins folded the map and handed it to me. "I think it's better not to find out." After taking my contact information, the sheriff excused himself, promising to be in touch if anything developed. As the bell jingled behind him, Mrs. Stevens sighed. "He's a good man, Tom. Been sheriff here for almost 30 years, but even he knows there are places in these hills where his badge doesn't carry much weight." I helped her finish unloading the furniture, both of us working in companionable silence. When the last piece was in place, she insisted on feeding me before I hit the road again. "There's a diner across the street, Maggie's. Best meatloaf this side of the Appalachians. My treat for all the trouble you've had." I started to decline, but realized I was famished. The sandwich from Earl's felt like days ago rather than hours. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Stevens." "Mary, please, and it's the least I can do. Besides," she added with a small smile, "you'll be safer in town for a bit longer. at least until full dark. You think they're less likely to cause trouble after nightfall? I asked, confused. Her smile faded. I think they own the night in these parts, Rocco, and I think you'd do well to be on the interstate before the last light fades from the sky. Maggie's diner was a slice of Americana frozen in time. Red vinyl booths, black and white checkered floor, and a jukebox in the corner playing hits from the 50s and 60s. A handful of locals occupied tables, their conversations creating a gentle buzz of background noise. Mrs. Stevens, Mary, led me to a booth by the window, where we could see Main Street and the gradual transition from day to evening. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a name tag that read Darlene, greeted Mary like an old friend. "The usual Mary?" she asked, pencil poised over her order pad. "Please, and my friend here will have the meatloaf special." I raised an eyebrow at her ordering for me, but she just winked. "Trust me." When Darlene left, I leaned forward, keeping my voice low. "Tell me more about these people. The ones in the woods. How long has this been going on?" Mary considered the question, absently stirring her water with a straw. "The families themselves have been here forever. The Blackwaters, the Kinseys, the Thorntons. They were here before Whiteland was even a town. They served in the Revolution, owned logging operations during the timber boom, ran moonshine during Prohibition. And now?" She shrugged. "Some work legitimate jobs. Others don't. There are rumors about meth labs deep in the forest, poaching operations, chop shops for stolen vehicles. Nothing anyone can prove. But the harassment of travelers, that's more recent. It picked up after they started expanding the state park about 5 years ago. The government seized some land through eminent domain, including parcels that had been in these families for generations. Our food arrived, meatloaf for me, a chef's salad for Mary. She was right about the quality. The meatloaf was perhaps the best I'd ever tasted, seasoned perfectly and accompanied by real mashed potatoes and gravy. As we ate, Mary continued her history lesson, painting a picture of a community divided. The town proper, with its law-abiding citizens and quaint charm, and the surrounding wilderness where different rules applied. "Most of us in town have learned to coexist with them," she explained. "We don't go where we're not wanted. They leave us alone for the most part. It's outsiders who bear the brunt of their territorial instincts. But why target random travelers? What does that accomplish?" Mary dabbed at her lips with a napkin. "Fear is a powerful deterrent, Rocco. If word gets around that these back roads aren't safe, fewer people use them. Fewer hikers venture into certain parts of the forest. Less scrutiny of what goes on in those areas. It made a twisted kind of sense, I had to admit. And the authorities just allow this? It's complicated. These families have connections. Cousins on the town council, nephews in the state police. And like Tom said, proving anything is nearly impossible. No one talks. No one testifies." Through the window, I watched as streetlights flickered on along Main Street. The sky had deepened to purple, the first stars appearing like distant beacons. A sense of urgency gripped me. I needed to be on the road, following Jenkins's suggested route to the interstate. Mary seemed to sense my anxiety. "You should get going. It's a beautiful night for driving." I paid for our meal despite her protests, thanking her for the information and the company. Outside, the air had cooled slightly, carrying the scent of pine from the surrounding forest. "Be careful out there," Mary said as we parted. "Stick to the route Tom showed you." "I will, and thank you for everything." She nodded, then added, "Oh, and Rocco, if you do make deliveries this way again, come during daylight hours, and maybe consider carrying something more substantial than a tire iron." The implied suggestion wasn't lost on me. I smiled grimly and headed for my truck. Bertha started on the first try, her engine a comforting rumble in the quiet town. I pulled away from Stevens Furniture, following Main Street to its eastern end, where it connected with Route 29, the safer path Jenkins had recommended. The town quickly fell away behind me, replaced by open farmland bathed in the silvery light of a rising moon. I kept my speed steady, eyes constantly checking mirrors, scanning the road ahead. The radio picked up a classic rock station, and I turned it up, grateful for the company. For the first half hour, the drive was uneventful. Route 29 was well maintained, with actual shoulders and reflective markers. Traffic was sparse but present. The occasional car or pickup, a few tractor trailers like mine. Each set of headlights in my mirror caused a spike of anxiety until they either passed me or turned off. I was beginning to relax, convinced I'd left the danger behind in those woods, when I noticed a vehicle that had been behind me for several miles. It was keeping a consistent distance, not too close, not falling behind. Its headlights were distinctive, one slightly dimmer than the other, like a lazy eye. "Don't be paranoid," I muttered to myself. Plenty of people use this road. Still, I found myself watching it more than was strictly necessary. When I increased my speed slightly, the vehicle matched me. When I tapped my brakes, it slowed as well. I was approaching a small town, Riverdale, according to the signs. The main street was brightly lit, with a few businesses still open despite the hour. I made a sudden decision, signaling and pulling into the parking lot of a gas station. The vehicle continued past, not a Chevy, but a dark-colored pickup truck. I caught only a glimpse of the driver as it passed under a streetlight, a silhouette that revealed nothing except that he was alone. I waited 5 minutes, then pulled back onto Route 29, telling myself I was being ridiculous. The interstate was less than 30 miles ahead now. Once there, I'd be surrounded by traffic, safe in the anonymity of the highway system. The road leaving Riverdale curved through low hills, occasionally offering views of the valley below. In daylight, it would have been picturesque. At night, with my nerves on edge, every shadow seemed to conceal a threat. 10 miles outside of town, I spotted headlights in my mirror again. The same uneven pair, growing steadily larger as the vehicle gained ground. My pulse quickened. It could be a coincidence, of course. The same driver, having stopped briefly himself, now back on the road. Or it could be something else entirely. I pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing Bertha toward her upper limits. The headlights fell back slightly, then began to close the gap again. Whoever was driving knew these roads well, taking curves at speeds that would be suicidal for someone unfamiliar with the terrain. Up ahead, I saw the glow of interstate lights on the horizon. Civilization, safety. Just a few more miles. The pickup was close now, close enough that I could make out its outline. An older model Ford, dark green or black. It swung out suddenly, accelerating into the oncoming lane. For a terrifying moment, I thought it was going to try to force me off the road. Instead, it pulled alongside me, pacing my truck. I kept my eyes forward, hands tight on the wheel, but I could feel the driver watching me. Then, without warning, the pickup swerved toward me. I jerked the wheel, narrowly avoiding collision. The pickup dropped back, then surged forward again, this time pulling ahead and cutting in front of me with inches to spare. "Son of a bitch!" I swore, hitting the brakes hard. The pickup slowed as well, matching my decreased speed, trapping me behind it. Then its brake lights flashed, once, twice, 3 times. A signal. My mouth went dry. This wasn't random harassment. This was coordinated, deliberate. The interstate entrance was visible now, less than a mile ahead. If I could reach it. The pickup's window rolled down, and an arm emerged, waving something I couldn't identify at first. As we passed under a streetlight, I saw it clearly. A crowbar, the metal gleaming in the artificial light. It was him, or one of his associates. The message was clear. We're not finished. The arm withdrew, and the pickup suddenly accelerated, speeding toward the interstate entrance. It took the on-ramp at dangerous speed, fishtailing slightly before disappearing onto the highway. I followed more cautiously, heart pounding, scanning the traffic for the dark pickup, It was nowhere to be seen, having either exited immediately or blended in with the steady flow of vehicles. For the next 100 miles, I drove in a state of hypervigilance, scrutinizing every vehicle that came near me, expecting at any moment to see the pickup or the blue Chevy materialize from the darkness. But as the miles accumulated and the Pennsylvania landscape gave way to Ohio, the tension gradually began to ease. By the time I crossed into Indiana, exhaustion had replaced fear. I pulled into a large truck stop outside of Fort Wayne, a brightly lit, bustling oasis of diesel pumps and fast food restaurants. The parking lot was filled with dozens of semis, drivers either sleeping in their cabs or socializing in the restaurant. I found a spot among them, securing Bertha for the night. Inside the truck stop, I showered, changed, and grabbed a quick meal, the normalcy of the routine helping to ground me after the surreal events of the day. Later, lying in the sleeper berth with the doors locked and curtains drawn, I replayed every moment of the encounter in my mind. The bearded man's face, Mary's warnings, the pickup on Route 29 with its uneven headlights and ominous signal. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of endless forest roads and pursuing headlights. In one particularly vivid nightmare, I was running through the woods again, but this time there was no ranger station, no truck to escape to. Just miles of identical trees and the sound of heavy footsteps always just behind me. I woke before dawn, drenched in sweat despite the AC. The truck stop was quiet, most drivers still sleeping. I made coffee in my portable maker and sat in the driver's seat, watching the sky lighten from black to deep blue to the pale gold of early morning. My phone showed several missed calls from my dispatcher. I'd forgotten to check in after the delivery, too preoccupied with escaping Whiteland and its surrounding dangers. I called her back, apologizing for the lapse. "Everything okay, Rocco?" she asked, concerned. "You've never missed a check-in before." I hesitated, unsure how much to share. The story sounded fantastical in the harsh light of day. Territorial backwoods families, coordinated harassment, a sheriff seemingly powerless to intervene. "Had some trouble with the truck," I lied. "Nothing major, just took longer than expected to get it sorted." "Well, as long as you're okay. I've got another pickup for you in Indianapolis if you're up for it." I accepted the assignment, partly from professional habit, partly from a desire to put as much distance as possible between myself and Pennsylvania. As I ended the call, I realized I was already constructing a narrative that minimized what had happened, transforming a terrifying pursuit into a minor mechanical issue. Was this how it worked? How these incidents remained isolated, unreported, each victim either unable to believe what had happened to them or unwilling to sound crazy by sharing it? I started Bertha's engine, comforted by its familiar rumble. The sky was fully light now, the truck stop coming alive with morning activity. I pulled out, merging onto the interstate, heading west toward Indiana and my next assignment. But as the miles passed beneath Bertha's wheels, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed. The open road, once a symbol of freedom and possibility, now held a darker potential. And somewhere behind me, in the forests and backroads of Pennsylvania, the bearded man and his associates continued their territorial patrol, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler to wander into their domain. 6 months passed. Winter came and went, its snow and ice presenting challenges of their own on the nation's highways. I continued my routes, crisscrossing the country with loads of varying size and importance. But I never returned to Whiteland, Pennsylvania, or anywhere near those particular backroads. It wasn't that I'd requested special treatment from my dispatcher. I hadn't shared the full story with anyone at Continental Freight. But somehow, assignments that would have taken me through central Pennsylvania were given to other drivers, while I handled routes through New England, the Deep South, and the Midwest. The incident, that's how I'd come to think of it, the incident, gradually receded in my memory, taking on the quality of a particularly vivid nightmare. Sometimes weeks would pass without my thinking of the bearded man or the forest chase. Other times, Something would trigger a flashback so intense it left me shaking. An old Chevy on the highway, a bearded man at a truck stop, the glint of metal that resembled a crowbar. On a mild spring evening in March, I found myself in a diner just outside of Cleveland, enjoying a rare home-cooked style meal between hauls. The place was half empty, the dinner rush having subsided. I sat at the counter, savoring a slice of apple pie that almost, but not quite, matched the quality of the one at Maggie's in Whiteland. The news played on a television mounted in the corner, the volume low enough that only fragments reached me. I wasn't paying attention until I heard the words Pennsylvania and disappearance. I looked up to see a reporter standing in front of a familiar backdrop, the entrance to Blackwater State Park. The caption at the bottom of the screen read, "Search continues for missing hiker." "Could you turn that up?" I asked the waitress, who obliged with a click of the remote. "Marks the third disappearance in the area in the past year," the reporter was saying. Todd Mercer, a 28-year-old graduate student from Pittsburgh, was last seen entering the eastern trail system of Blackwater State Park 10 days ago. Despite extensive searches by state police and volunteer groups, no trace of Mercer has been found. The scene cut to a middle-aged couple, their faces etched with worry. The man spoke, his voice breaking. Todd is an experienced hiker. He wouldn't just get lost. Something happened to him out there. Back to the reporter. Authorities say there's no evidence of foul play, but locals have long spoken of the dangers of venturing too deep into these woods. In 2023, hiker Jennifer Wells disappeared from the same area, her backpack discovered 3 miles from the designated trail. And last August, trucking company owner Michael Kavanaugh vanished while driving a shipment through the region. His truck was found abandoned on Route 16, with no sign of Kavanaugh himself. My blood ran cold. Route 16, the same road where I'd encountered the bearded man. The report continued, discussing the challenges of searching such dense woodland and the theories ranging from animal attacks to accidental falls. Not once did they mention the possibility I now felt certain was the truth, that something more deliberate, more human, was responsible for these disappearances. I paid my bill and left, my appetite gone. In my truck, I sat with the engine off, wrestling with a growing sense of responsibility. I had information, not proof, but knowledge, that might be relevant to these cases. Should I contact the authorities? Would they even believe me? After a long internal debate, I pulled out my phone and dialed the Pennsylvania State Police. It took several transfers before I reached someone in the relevant department, a Detective Hargrove who was assisting with the Mercer case. "I'm not sure if this is helpful," I began, "but I had an experience in that area last August that might be related." I recounted my story, the pursuit on Route 16, the chase through the state park, the information Mary Stevens had shared about territorial locals. Hargrove listened without interrupting, but I could sense skepticism in his occasional "I see" and When I finished, there was a long pause before he responded. "Mr. Delgado, I appreciate you coming forward. We follow up on all leads in cases like these. Did you file a report with local authorities at the time?" "Yes, with Sheriff Jenkins in Whiteland." "I see." Another pause. "And you didn't get a license plate or a clear look at the individual's face?" "No, he wore sunglasses the whole time. But I gave a physical description to Jenkins." "Well, we'll certainly look into it. If you don't mind, I'd like to get your contact information in case we have additional questions." I provided my details, but as the call ended, I had the distinct impression that my report would be filed away with other interesting but unverifiable accounts. Without concrete evidence, without a body, a weapon, a witness, it was just another story about the strange happenings in those Pennsylvania woods. That night, parked at a truck stop in eastern Ohio, I couldn't sleep. The faces of the missing people, Todd Mercer, Jennifer Wells, Michael Kavanaugh, haunted me. Had they encountered the same bearded man, or others like him, territorial guardians of those remote areas? Had they been less fortunate than I was, unable to escape whatever fate awaited those who ventured into forbidden territory? I pulled out my laptop and began searching for information about Whiteland and its surroundings. News articles about the disappearances were plentiful, but they all followed the same narrative: experienced outdoors people who had somehow fallen victim to the wilderness. The comment sections told a different story, filled with local rumors and warnings. Those woods ain't natural. My grandpappy used to say certain hollows were better left alone. Everyone knows you don't hike the East Trails. Rangers won't even go there after dark. The Thornton clan has owned that mountain since before the Revolution. The park boundaries don't mean nothing to them. I searched for information about the families Mary had mentioned: the Blackwaters, the Kinseys, the Thorntons. Public records showed property holdings, business registrations, the occasional minor criminal charge. Nothing that pointed to organized harassment or worse. But there were gaps in the information, blank spaces where these families intersected with the missing persons cases. No one directly accused them, but in the absence of other explanations, suspicion flourished. Around 2 a.m., exhausted but still uneasy, I finally closed my laptop. I had a delivery to make in the morning, and I needed at least a few hours of rest. As I settled into my sleeper berth, I made a decision. Once this haul was complete, I would take some personal time and return to Whiteland. Not to confront anyone or play detective, but to speak with Mary Stevens again, to see if she had more information that might help the families of the missing. 3 days later, I found myself back on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, heading east in my personal vehicle, a Ford F-150 less conspicuous than my usual 18-wheeler. I'd taken a week's leave from Continental, telling my dispatcher I needed to handle some family matters. I approached Whiteland from the west this time, avoiding Route 16 entirely. The town looked much as I remembered it: quaint, peaceful, seemingly untouched by the darker elements that lurked in the surrounding wilderness. Stevens' furniture was open, the display windows now showcasing patio sets and outdoor furniture appropriate for the approaching summer. A bell jangled as I entered, and a young man looked up from behind the counter. "Can I help you?" he asked. "I'm looking for Mary Stevens," I replied. "Is she available?" The young man, early 20s with Mary's same alert blue eyes, studied me for a moment. "She's in the back office. May I tell her who's asking?" "Rocco Delgado. I made a delivery here last August." Recognition flickered across his face. "The truck driver. Aunt Mary mentioned you." He extended his hand. "I'm Peter, Mary's nephew." He led me through the showroom to a small office in the rear of the building. Mary looked up from her computer as we entered, surprise and something like concern crossing her features. "Rocco," she said, rising from her desk. "This is unexpected." Peter excused himself, leaving us alone. Mary gestured to a chair across from her desk, studying me with the same perceptive gaze I remembered. "I didn't think we'd see you in Whiteland again," she said. "Not after—" She trailed off, the incident hanging unspoken between us. "I didn't plan to come back," I admitted. "But I saw a news report about a missing hiker in Blackwater State Park." Mary's expression tightened. "Todd Mercer, yes. It's been all over the local news. They mentioned 2 others as well, Jennifer Wells and Michael Kavanaugh." She nodded, her gaze dropping to her hands. 3 in less than 2 years. It's concerning." "Is it the same people, Mary? The ones who came after me?" She sighed, looking suddenly older than her years. "I don't know, Rocco. Not for certain, but the pattern—" "I called the state police," I told her. "Shared what happened to me. I'm not sure they took it seriously." "They rarely do. Without proof." She shrugged. "What exactly are you hoping to accomplish by coming back here?" It was a fair question, one I'd asked myself repeatedly during the drive east. I thought maybe there was more you could tell me, something that might help find these people or at least explain what happened to them. Mary was quiet for a long moment, considering. Finally, she stood. "Not here. Let's take a walk." We left the store, Mary telling Peter she'd be back in an hour. The spring afternoon was mild, the sky clear blue above the surrounding mountains. We walked in silence to a small park at the edge of town, finding a bench that offered privacy while still being publicly visible. "The families I told you about last time," Mary began, her voice low despite there being no one nearby to overhear. "Their influence goes deeper than I let on. The Thorntons especially." "How so?" "They don't just control territory, they control people. Through money, through fear, through generations of favors and threats." She plucked a leaf from a nearby bush, tearing it methodically as she spoke. "Half the county officials are either related to them or indebted to them in some way." "Including Sheriff Jenkins?" She hesitated. "Tom tries to maintain his independence, but his brother-in-law works for Thornton Logging, and his son got into some trouble a few years back that mysteriously went away after Tom met with Clayton Thornton." "Clayton Thornton?" "The patriarch. Mid-60s now, but still runs everything. His sons and nephews handle the day-to-day operations of whatever businesses the family controls, legal and otherwise." I thought of the bearded man who'd chased me. "One of his sons. Would he be tall, heavy-set, with a dark beard?" Mary nodded. "That sounds like Victor, the oldest. He's Clayton's enforcer, for lack of a better term. Handles problems, maintains discipline." "And problems would include strangers wandering into their territory?" "Among other things." She tossed aside the shredded leaf. "The disappearances. There's no proof linking them to the Thorntons or any of the other families. But there are rumors." "What kind of rumors?" Mary looked at me directly, her eyes grave. "That the missing weren't just scared off or chased away. That they saw something they shouldn't have or strayed too far into protected areas. That examples are made of those who don't respect boundaries." A chill ran through me despite the warm day. "You're talking about murder." "I'm talking about what people whisper when they think outsiders can't hear." She lowered her voice further. "There's a place deep in the state forest. Locals call it Thornton Hollow. It's not on any official maps, and park rangers avoid it by unspoken agreement. They say that's where the family handles their private business." "And no one investigates? No one tries to stop them?" Mary's laugh was bitter. "With what army, Rocco? The state police have limited resources and without bodies, without witnesses willing to testify." She shook her head. "Besides, these woods are vast. Hundreds of square miles of dense forest, caves, abandoned mine shafts. If someone wanted to make a body disappear permanently, there's no shortage of places to do it." We sat in silence for a while, the implications of her words settling over me like a shadow. Finally, I asked the question that had been gnawing at me since I'd seen the news report. "Why did I make it out? If they're willing to dispose of people who cross them, why let me go?" Mary considered this. "Maybe because you reported the incident immediately, made yourself too visible to simply disappear. Or maybe Victor was just testing boundaries that day, not looking to escalate to something more serious." She paused. "Or maybe you were simply lucky." The thought was sobering. My escape, which I'd attributed to quick thinking and driving skill, might have been nothing more than the whim of a man who could have chosen a much darker outcome. "I should report this," I said. "What you've told me about Thornton Hollow, about Victor." "And say what? That a local furniture store owner shared unsubstantiated rumors with you?" She shook her head. "Without evidence, it's just stories, Rocco. And stories won't help find Todd Mercer or the others. So what do? Nothing? Let them continue to prey on anyone who stumbles into their territory?" Mary's face softened with sympathy. "I understand your frustration. Believe me, many of us in town feel the same way. But confronting the Thorntons directly would be suicide, and the authorities are either compromised or hamstrung by legal constraints." She stood, signaling the end of our conversation. "My advice? Go home, Rocco. Live your life. Be grateful you escaped with yours. And if your work ever brings you near these parts again, take another route. I finished for her. We walked back to the store in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. At the entrance, Mary paused. There's a community meeting tonight at the town hall, 7 o'clock, about the recent disappearances. She hesitated. Clayton Thornton will be there. He always attends these things, makes a show of community concern, offers resources for search efforts. You think I should go? I think if you want to understand what we're dealing with, seeing Clayton in his public persona might be illuminating. She touched my arm briefly. Just don't draw attention to yourself. And don't mention our conversation to anyone. I promised I wouldn't, thanked her for her time, and headed back to my truck. The afternoon stretched before me, hours to fill before the evening meeting. I drove through town, familiarizing myself with its layout, the small grocery store, the diner where I'd eaten with Mary, the town hall where tonight's meeting would be held. At the eastern edge of Whiteland, the road forked. The left branch leading toward the interstate, the safer route I'd taken when leaving 6 months ago. The right branch becoming Route 16, the road where my encounter had begun. Almost without conscious decision, I found myself turning right. Route 16 looked different in daylight and springtime, less ominous, more picturesque. Trees that had been skeletal in August were now vibrant with new foliage. Wildflowers dotted the roadside, and the afternoon sun cast dappled patterns through the canopy. I drove cautiously, alert for any sign of a blue Chevy or other threatening vehicles. But the road was peaceful, traffic sparse but present. A few local cars, a delivery van, a Pennsylvania Department of Conservation truck. After about 15 minutes, I saw the sign for Earl's Rest Stop and Gas. It looked much as I remembered, worn and weathered, a relic of simpler times. I pulled in, parking near the ancient oak tree where the blue Chevy had waited 6 months ago. The bell above the door jangled as I entered. Earl himself stood behind the counter, apparently unchanged since my last visit. He looked up, recognition flickering in his eyes. "You're the trucker," he said, "from last summer." I nodded, surprised he remembered. "Good memory. Don't get many strangers passing through twice." He studied me, brow furrowed. "You made it out okay then?" I did. No thanks to the guy in the blue Chevy. Earl's expression didn't change, but his eyes darted to the window, checking the parking lot. "What brings you back this way? Not driving truck today?" "Personal business in Whiteland." I approached the counter, keeping my voice casual. "Heard about the missing hiker on the news. Makes me wonder if he ran into the same trouble I did." Earl busied himself rearranging items behind the counter. "Can't say. Don't know nothing about that." "You warned me, though. Last time. Told me to be careful on these roads." "Just being neighborly." His tone made it clear the conversation was over. I bought a soda I didn't really want, thanked him, and left. Back in my truck, I sat for a moment, observing the rest stop and the surrounding woods. In daylight, it was hard to reconcile this peaceful scene with the terror I'd felt here 6 months ago. Had I overreacted? Misinterpreted a random encounter with a local? No. The bearded man, Victor Thornton if Mary was correct, had chased me with a crowbar, had followed me into the state park, had sent someone to intimidate me on my way out of the area. Whatever game he was playing, it wasn't innocent. I continued down Route 16, eventually reaching the gravel turnout where I'd pulled over and the confrontation had escalated. It was empty today, just a patch of crushed stone beside the road. Further on, I passed the entrance to Blackwater State Park, the stone marker now adorned with missing person flyers bearing Todd Mercer's face and details. I didn't turn in. Whatever answers lay within those woods, I wasn't equipped to find them alone. Instead, I completed my circuit, eventually returning to Whiteland as afternoon faded toward evening. At 7 o'clock, I joined a stream of locals heading into the town hall, a stately brick building at the center of Main Street. The meeting room was nearly full, folding chairs arranged in rows facing a small stage where town officials sat at a long table. Sheriff Jenkins was among them, along with what appeared to be the mayor and several council members. I found a seat near the back, trying to blend in despite being a stranger in a community where everyone seemed to know each other. As the meeting began, I scanned the room, looking for the man Mary had described as Clayton Thornton. I spotted him almost immediately, seated in the front row, commanding attention without saying a word. He was in his mid-60s, as Mary had said, with silvery hair cut military short and a bearing that suggested former service. Unlike his son, if Victor was indeed his son, Clayton was clean-shaven and immaculately dressed in what appeared to be a tailored suit. He looked more like a successful businessman or politician than the head of a backwoods crime family. The mayor opened the meeting, expressing concern for Todd Mercer and solidarity with his family. The search efforts were outlined, areas covered, resources deployed, assistance from neighboring counties and state agencies. Sheriff Jenkins spoke next, his tone professional but tired. We've covered approximately 60% of the designated search area, focusing on the eastern trails where Mr. Mercer was last seen. We've employed cadaver dogs, volunteer groups, and aerial reconnaissance where possible. So far, we have no new leads or evidence. A woman in the audience stood, middle-aged, well-dressed, with the confident air of someone used to being heard. And what about the other disappearances, Sheriff? Jennifer Wells? Michael Kavanaugh? Are we looking at a pattern here? Jenkins' expression remained neutral. We're exploring all possibilities, Ms. Harrison. But there's no concrete evidence linking these cases. 3 people in 2 years, all in the same general area? Her voice was skeptical. Seems like more than coincidence. Before Jenkins could respond, Clayton Thornton stood, turning to face the audience. His voice, when he spoke, was deep and cultured, at odds with my mental image of a backwoods patriarch. If I may, he began, nodding deferentially to the officials on stage. We're all concerned about these incidents. My family has lived in these mountains for generations, and we know how dangerous they can be to the unprepared. That's why Thornton Logging is offering additional resources for the search efforts, equipment, personnel, access to our private roads. The woman who had spoken, Ms. Harrison, wasn't satisfied. With all due respect, Mr. Thornton, some of those private roads might be helpful to the investigation now. There are areas of the forest that remain inaccessible to search teams because they cross your property. Clayton's smile never wavered. And as I've told Sheriff Jenkins, we're happy to provide guided access to any area that might be relevant. But some of those roads aren't safe for standard vehicles, and we wouldn't want to risk the safety of volunteers. The exchange continued, polite on the surface but with undercurrents of tension. Clayton deflected every implicit accusation with the skill of a seasoned politician, always bringing the conversation back to his concern for the community and his family's commitment to helping. As I watched, I tried to reconcile this sophisticated, articulate man with the brutal territorial system Mary had described. If Clayton Thornton was indeed responsible for creating an environment where outsiders were harassed, even harmed, for venturing into the wrong areas, he hid it well behind a mask of civic responsibility. The meeting continued for another hour, with updates from search coordinators and discussions of next steps. Throughout, Clayton remained engaged and supportive, offering suggestions, volunteering resources. It was a masterful performance, if that's what it was. As the meeting concluded, people broke into smaller groups, conversations continuing in hushed tones. I rose to leave, not wanting to draw attention by lingering. At the door, I nearly collided with Sheriff Jenkins, who was exiting at the same time. "Excuse me," I murmured, stepping aside. He looked at me, recognition dawning slowly. "Mr. Delgado, the truck driver from last summer?" I nodded, surprised he remembered. "Just passing through again. Thought I'd stop by." Jenkins glanced around, then lowered his voice. Got a call from state police. Detective Hargrove said you reached out about the Mercer case. I thought my experience might be relevant. Maybe. His expression was unreadable. Maybe not. Either way, be careful what connections you suggest around here. Some folks don't appreciate speculation. Before I could respond, he was gone, moving to speak with another group of citizens. His warning, veiled but unmistakable, left me cold. I left the town hall, stepping into the cool evening air. The streets of Whiteland were quiet now, most businesses closed for the night. As I walked toward my truck, I had the distinct sensation of being watched. Across the street, a dark vehicle was parked in the shadows between streetlights. As I approached my truck, it started its engine. When I pulled away from the curb, it followed, maintaining a discreet distance. Not the blue Chevy, not the pickup from my escape route, but something similar in intent, a reminder that I was seen, that my presence was noted. I drove to the small motel at the edge of town where I'd checked in earlier, the dark vehicle remaining a constant presence in my mirrors until I turned into the parking lot. It didn't follow me in, instead continuing past, its driver's face invisible behind tinted windows. But the message was clear. I wasn't welcome here, and someone, the Thorntons presumably, wanted me to know it. In my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, weighing my options. I'd come hoping for answers, for some way to help find the missing and perhaps prevent future disappearances. Instead, I'd found only more questions, more shadows, and the growing certainty that powerful forces were at work to keep certain truths hidden. Mary's advice echoed in my mind. Go home, Rocco. Live your life. Be grateful you escaped with yours. Perhaps she was right. What could one truck driver do against a system so entrenched, so protected by silence and fear? The authorities were either compromised or hamstrung by lack of evidence. The locals, for the most part, seemed resigned to the status quo. And yet, somewhere in those woods, 3 people had vanished without a trace. Their families deserved answers, closure. And how many more would disappear if nothing changed? I thought of the bearded man, Victor Thornton, and his father, Clayton, with his polished manners and calculated generosity. I thought of Sheriff Jenkins, walking the line between duty and self-preservation. Of Earl, who warned travelers but claimed to know nothing when pressed. And I thought of myself 6 months ago, running through the forest with a tire iron, certain I was fighting for my life. How close had I come to becoming another statistic, another face on a missing person flyer? Sleep eluded me that night. My dreams when they came filled with endless roads, pursuing headlights, and forests that swallowed people whole, leaving no trace behind. In the morning, I checked out of the motel and headed west, back toward the interstate and home. But as I left Whiteland in my rearview mirror, I knew this wouldn't be the end. The story of what happened in those Pennsylvania woods, what was still happening, wasn't finished. And somehow, whether by choice or circumstance, I had become part of it. The road stretched before me, familiar yet changed, like everything else since that August day when a blue Chevy appeared in my mirrors and a bearded man approached my truck with a crowbar in hand. I'd survived the encounter, escaped the danger. But the echoes of that day continued to reverberate, and the shadows of what lay hidden in those mountains had followed me home. They were still following, I suspected, and would be for a long time to come.